Hello, today we're going to be looking at painting trees. It's one of those subjects that I get asked about a lot. So I'm going to show you a few techniques just to make it a lot easier for you. They're really simple, using just the basic colours and a few different brushes. So we're going to look at drawing them first and then how to build up layers. So the paints I'm using are our Payne's Grey. I've got that in the middle. That's the one we use for darkening up. We're going to use that instead of black. I've got an alizarin crimson. I've got a raw umber. On its own, it's actually quite a dull brown, but we'll use that for mixing. I've got an ultramarine here as well, just an ordinary blue. I've got a nice bright cadmium yellow and a standard sap green, which again, I'm going to use for mixing. In terms of brushes, I've got a couple of round brushes. I've also got a couple of riggers. And these are the long, thin ones. These are really useful for trees, so definitely worth picking those up. Also got a flat brush as well. So I've got my nice soft pencil, my putty rubber, and I'm working on a smooth 300 GSM paper. So even though this isn't going to be a finished painting, it's just a practice sheet, I always still stick it down to a board just so that it dries nice and flat. So when people try and draw and paint trees, I think they think about all the individual leaves and they overcomplicate it. We really need to simplify it, and rather than trying to draw individual branches, twigs, leaves, we need to look at the tree as a mass and areas of lights and darks. So I always paint my tree first, the foliage, the leaves, and then I actually add the trunk in afterwards. It always seems a lot easier to me. So I think I'm just going to start off here. I'm going to try and fit a couple in here actually. So I will put my trunk in of where that's going to go. I always do a single line. I find it easier than trying to fill in a double line. So I'm just going to give an indicator of where my tree's going to go. And really, I don't want an awful lot of information here. I'm going to rely on my paints rather than my pencil work. So I'm going to put a branch up here. Now trees vary enormously, but they all pretty much do the same thing, which is the branches reach up towards the light. So as a tree starts growing, the first branches, they can reach up towards the light reasonably easily. As it grows, the tree's actually having to reach around the existing branches. So what happens is they actually start to come out at an angle more towards 45 degrees. So the top ones here, they reach up. These ones are almost reaching around. So I'm going to add on to this. This is just giving me a rough idea. And by the time your branches get to the bottom here, they're almost at a 45-degree angle. And as we know, some of them probably even reach down. So I've kept this really light. So we know that watercolour paint is translucent, it's see-through. We're going to build this up in layers, but we really don't want to see too much pencil marks, even though we are going to put some branches on. So I'm going to start looking at sort of the mass areas. So rather than putting tiny little leaves on, I just want to look at this in a much more general way. First thing I'm going to do is put on the general shape of my tree. And I'm actually going to use this bright yellow in with a little bit of my sap green. So you notice when I put my paints out, I always leave little pots empty, and those are my mixing ones. I just find it an awful lot easier. So I've got my cadmium yellow there, nice bright yellow. I'm actually making sure that I clean off my brush. I've got some test strips here. I'm going to try those out on my test strips. So I've got a really bright green here. Mix a little bit more of that. A bit more yellow. A bit more of the green. this is the one I'm going to use for my absolutely lightest leaves. So test that out on here. That's a really nice bright green. Perfect. So I'm going to try and show you today at least two. One sort of springtime where the leaves are really bright and just coming out, and then another one with the autumn colours on. So now I'm going to take some of my green. Actually going to pop a little bit of Payne's grey into that, as well as the tiniest bit of blue. So we're making this much, much cooler. Just mix up a little bit more. A little bit more blue. I think this has probably gone a bit too blue now, but I'm going to try this out. Yep, so I want more green back into that. So this is almost a sort of dark forest green. Much better. And I've got the one that I started off with, which I can also use a bit of as well. Let's give myself a little bit more of that. So obviously, if you don't use tubes, if you use the pans, just work with some corresponding colours, something similar to the ones that I've picked out. So that's going to be my mid-green. I'm actually just going to add the tiniest bit of brown to that, just to take it down slightly. So I'm going to be working with those three greens now. So first thing I'm going to do is put on the lighter colours. We're going to work from the lighter upwards. So what we really want to do to make this tree look really good is just decide on a light source. So which side the light is coming from. So where our light's going to be, where the shadow is going to be. So don't do this on yours, but I'm just going to show you here. This is going to be my light source here. So if I imagine the sun's here, this is the light side, this is the dark side. And the other place to remember that it's going to be dark is underneath. We're not going to get any light coming up from here. So that's just so you can see. So this is the light, and this is shadow. So I'm going to actually start off with a slightly larger brush. I'm going to use the wet on wet method. So I'm putting some water in, I'm putting it in with the side, I'm leaving some areas that have got no water on at all because I want some gaps. So don't do a solid tree, we want some of the sky coming in behind. So I'm just dotting that on. I'm going to try and keep some areas throughout the layers that are going to be white. So same brush, I'm just going to take my absolutely lightest green, my really pale green. I'm just going to drop that on. Now because it's going on to a wet page, we're already starting to get some variety in the colour. So we've got some darker and some lighter. So I know this seems like a really large brush to use actually, but what happens is if you use a larger brush, you don't overthink it. You don't start trying to put in individual leaves, you're just putting in areas. It's widening out towards the bottom, and we've kept in some really nice light areas, and our branches are going to thread their way through those gaps later on. So right down to the bottom. So obviously my tree's fairly symmetrical. Best thing to do is work from a photograph, and that'll give you a really good idea of some shapes. So I'm just darkening that up slightly towards the trunk here by putting in extra paint. Same at the bottom. Just going to add in a little bit more. This colour looks really bright at the moment, but it's a great colour for the first layer. So we're just going to leave that to dry off, and then we're going to start to look at some of the lighter and the darker areas. We don't want it completely dry. I still want it a little bit wet because I want the next layer to move a little bit. So we're going to go in with this mid-green. Probably going to swap down to the medium brush again. So let that dry off for a moment. Then I'm going to take my mid-green. So this is the sap green with a little bit of raw umber in it. So I'm thinking now about where the shadow is, where the light's coming, and where I'm going to have some darker leaves. They're definitely going to go in towards the trunk. So you can see I'm just dropping this in. It's still wet, so it's still moving about. So when I build up my layers, I still want to be able to see some of the one from underneath. So my light's coming from here. I want this to stay nice and light. So I think people can get quite intimidated about drawing and painting trees actually, but once you break it down into these simple steps, they're really not so difficult. Now at the bottom here, because this is in shadow, obviously any light comes from the top, the underneath of the tree is always dark. I like the way this is starting to move around. So even though this is the shadow side, I've still got some of this light colour showing through. I can break up these edges a little. Just adding in some dots. It's a very neat tree actually. Nice and symmetrical. So I want to keep this light. I'm going to take this a little bit darker, just at the bottom here. Nice and dark here. So again, we leave that for a moment to dry off. And then we can actually put in our very dark colour now. So while that's drying off, I'm just going to draw in a second tree here, exactly the same again. I'll just put the lime for the trunk. And this time, we're going to do something more autumnal. So it's not going to have as much foliage on, a lot less. So again, we're going to just pop in a few branches. So don't worry about the details of all the twigs. We're literally just putting in some branches and remembering that they come out because they're trying to reach around the first branches to reach up to the sun. So these branches that I'm drawing on, they're not set in stone. They will probably change once I've got my foliage on. I tend to do the leaves and then put the details in afterwards. A nice long one here. And this trunk, just one line, that will thicken up afterwards. So I'm going to be looking at some slightly different colours here. I'm actually going to start off with the same green. So do exactly the same again. So I'm going to have my light source coming from exactly the same side again, just so I don't confuse things. Putting this water on. I'm going to let this roll about. I'm going to put my first layer on. So still with my same brush, just going to put a few bits of green. So less this time, because we've got less leaves on this tree. I'm keeping this quite light, more towards the middle. So generally much lighter, much paler. Then I'm going to come back to my first tree and drop in the really dark areas. So this time I'm working with the sap green, which had a little bit of ultramarine and also a little bit of the Payne's grey. So with this medium brush, I'm actually putting in some quite dark areas now. Keep it quite dark towards the trunk, underneath, and where our shadow side is. So I'm still looking at areas of light and dark rather than individual leaves. Still want some light areas because I want some branches going through those. Nice and dark at the bottom. And I can even add in just a little bit of Payne's grey right to the bottom here. So I'm just dotting in that really dark green now. Getting some detail towards this edge. But I've still retained in here 2 or 3 different colours. So I need to take this edge out a little. It looks a bit too neat for me. Keeping it dark at the bottom. So hopefully you can see that this tree is built up really simply. 3 colours. We haven't even got any branches in yet, but you can already see that there's some shape to this. A really nice area where the light is hitting it, much darker on this other side. We've got masses of light and dark rather than looking at individual leaves. So I'm just going to leave this one for the moment and work on my autumn one, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to put in the trunk and the branches. So now we're going to have another look at our slightly autumnal one. So we've used exactly the same base colour here, which if you remember was our sap green with a little bit of the yellow mixed in. So now we want something a lot more orangey. So we can go back to our yellow, add in a little bit of this red. This is a really nice alizarin crimson. It's quite pinky, but it will make us a nice orange autumnal colour. And we can also take some of our brown. So I rarely use this raw umber on its own. It's a really good mixing brown. Put a little bit of our alizarin crimson in with that. Remember, we're going to be working on top of this very pale green as well. And we can use some of that alizarin crimson on its own. I'm going to put these on the test strip so you can see the sort of colours that I've mixed here. So this is the kind of orangey colour, peachy orange, that we're going to use. And we've got something slightly darker. We're going to use a little bit of alizarin crimson on its own. And I might pop a few darker bits of green on the bottom too. So we're going to build up in exactly the same way as we did the first tree. We just want less foliage. So this is still slightly damp. So we always go from light to darker. I'm going to keep this nice and light on the top here. This is our light source, if you remember. A few little bits of green coming through. So it's absolutely key that you get your second layer of paint on while the first one is still slightly wet, because this is where the colour spreads and you get some really nice effects. So put this all the way over. So already this is looking really lovely and autumnal. So if you put an orange and a green together, they make brown anyway. So that's how we're getting some of these nice dark colours here. So keep this fairly light. Then going to go in with a slightly darker one. Being very careful to leave some white gaps here so that our branches can go through. So it's always really important when you're using watercolours to keep your layers nice and light. The art of watercolour is to build up lots of translucent layers, and you almost need the light bouncing back from the white paper just to make it glow. If you go on too thick or too many layers, it becomes very dark, almost like poster paint. So you keep it nice and light. So we're darkening up. Remember, this is our shadow side. Probably going to come in and put a little bit of extra green at the bottom here, so we're keeping it nice and dark. Now if you feel you've gone on a little too much, you can take some paper towel and lift. I'm just going to do that here. and at the top there. I'm going to go back in with a little bit of my green here. So my shadow side is over here. And on the edges, I'm just going to pull out and go back and put in a nice bright orangey colour again. To keep it nice and light. So let me mix a little bit more of my red with what I've got left of my yellow. Let's try that out. So where we've worked in the middle with much more general areas, as I get towards the edge, I start to work with some dots. I'm thinking a little bit more about some of the branches that are just coming out with a few odd leaves on them. Same at the bottom. Same on this side. I can start to put a little bit of that red in as well. So this just really makes it pop. So this is alizarin crimson. Put that in along the bottom. I'm going to go back to my really dark green as well. So I'm going to wipe that off. So this green was the one that we mixed the sap green, a little bit of Payne's grey, just to darken that down. Add a little bit of blue in it as well. So we're going to keep this nice and dark along the bottom. And towards the branch. Just any of the areas really where you wouldn't get much light coming through. So this has started to pool here, and I'm actually going to take that out. Take round here as well, want it a little bit lighter. And there we go, there are autumn colours. Now if we have a look on this one, we can come back here. So this is our kind of spring tree. I really like some of the things that are happening under here. I think it still needs to be a little bit darker. So again, my paint has pooled. I'm just going to draw a little bit out. I'm going with some Payne's grey and darken up all along the bottom. This is still wet. That's actually the darkest part of the tree, is here on the side that is the shadow and the underneath. I'm going to put a few little bits just in, again, darkest area by the trunk. It becomes lighter the further out that it becomes. So I don't want to overwork this. The other thing you can do is to see areas of light and dark, is to almost squint your eyes a little bit, and then it almost takes the colour out and you can start to see areas of light and dark. So if I do that, I can see that this area is still really nice and light, central, it's like an upside down T in that this is dark, underneath is dark. If I switch over to this one, this area here, it's still a little bit lighter, so I need to darken that up a touch. So we're going to let those dry off, and then we're going to come and we will put in the trunks, the branches, and a few little twigs, and just a few finishing touches. So I've dried these off now. I'm going to have a look at where I want to maybe lift some areas, darken some areas. I actually want to lighten this. I've put a little bit more of that lovely cadmium yellow in. I'm just going to pop a couple of little highlights here, right on the edge. So this is our light source on this area. Just picking out a few little bits there, and right up on the top of our tree. We do the same on here. Just going to lighten. Don't want too much. I want to make sure I've got plenty of gaps in here for our branches to come through. So that's just made those pop. I think they're dark enough. I might put a little bit more dark into here. This one I'm quite happy with. I think there's a lot of variety on there and I'm really pleased with that. I'm going to take the Payne's Grey. Just darken up under there. Just a little bit, but that will make the difference. Just thread some dark through. And then we can, so this is dark bits right underneath. And then we can look at the branches. So I'm just going to mix up a colour for my trunk. I don't want something brown. So, you know, when young children paint trees, they just go for a really straight, dark brown trunk. Actually, trunks have a whole variety of colours in them. So we're going to try and get a little bit of texture as well. So I'm actually going to start off with this really dark green that I mixed. I'm going to add some of my brown into that and a little bit of Payne's Grey. So depending on the type of tree as well, it's worth having a look at it. So a lot of fir trees, I would almost put a blue in. A little bit more of my Payne's Grey. Okay, so again, try it out on my test strip. That's quite a good colour. So I'm going to use my round brush. I'm going to start at the base here. This wants to go wider the further towards the ground it is. So it's very rare that branches get thicker the further from the trunk they are. So you always want to bear that in mind. Put a nice wide trunk on this one. So don't be tempted to draw in both sides of the trunk. Then you end up almost filling a block. You actually want it to be a little bit more fluid than that. So I always put one line down when I'm drawing and then either paint one side of it or both sides. So I'm going to have a split in my trunk here. So I'm going to draw this up. So where this goes into the ground, I'm just going to spread that out. It's unlikely you're going to be painting a tree on its own. You'll probably do that in amongst a landscape. So you'll probably have some leaves at the bottom. We'll probably put some in on here, or you'll have grasses and that sort of thing. So at the moment we're just sticking to the tree. Later on I'll be doing some short videos on landscapes and some full tutorials as well. And that's when we'll use these trees. So the other thing I'm always really careful about when I'm painting trees is that I tend not to put branches opposite each other. I tend to stagger them a little. So I'm going to pull one in from here. It's going to meet our trunk. So you can already see that this tree is starting to look much more natural now that I've got these on. Now I'm going to swap to a different brush. So I'm going to use one of these riggers. So these are really long and thin. They come in different sizes. I've got a couple of sizes here. This one's a little bit thicker. They always look fluffy when you just get them out of the pack. As soon as they're wet, they go to a really good point. And we can use these brushes in lots of different ways. I use them on animal fur, grasses, but they're absolutely perfect for doing branches. So when you're going with a slightly thicker one here, you can do this with a detail brush if you don't have one of these riggers. So I'm going in with the same colour. And now I'm just going to start to build on this. So I'm using it right on the metal. And I'm building up branches and twigs, crossing them over so they thicken up as they get down towards the trunk. And I'm crossing them over. And as I get further up the tree, they're going to cross over some of our leaves. You want to be able to see some of the branches through this foliage where you've got the white gaps. I'm actually going to put them slightly darker here. So I've now picked up a little bit of my Payne's grey. So where you've got the gaps, you can have branches coming through here and twigs right out to the very end. So using a fine brush here, either a rigger or your detail, the idea is just to build up. And this is something you can have a practice with, this brush as well. So where it's lighter, I'm able to see a lot more of the branches and the twigs. So they always get finer the further away from the trunk. I'm going to put some slightly darker ones on this side, so I'm working with my Payne's grey. I'm going to leave that for a moment. I'll come back and have a look and see if I need anything else on there. So now onto my autumn one. I'm going to do exactly the same. I'm going to start off with my dark brown. I'm going to go in with my medium brush first. Make this one slightly greener. I'm going to put my trunk on, make this one longer. Put some autumn leaves at the bottom here, I think. So my trunk needs to be thicker the nearer the ground it is. I can actually run this one, main branch, up. And then I'm going to come in with the finer brush. So I'm going to take the finer brush, I'm going to let this dry for a moment, and I'm actually going to put a little bit of shadow down this side of the trunk as well, just to give it a little bit of shape. So we remember that this is our shadow side. Back in, I'm going to start to put branches in exactly the same as we did on the other tree. Now we'll see a lot more of them on this one because there's less foliage. Just build these up, remembering that they're always thicker towards the trunk, and you just lift your brush as you pull it away. Right out. Same on the other side. Finer the further away from the trunk, and here I'm just pushing my brush down, a little bit more pressure on it, and that actually thickens that brush stroke. So you just build this up. You don't want too many. You want to still be able to see our beautiful coloured leaves. It's a balance really. So I'm just going to put some slightly wider ones towards the trunk. That definitely looks better. And now I need some coming off of our trunk. Now I'm just going to darken one side of this. So while I've still got this rigger brush, I'm going to take some Payne's grey. Just going to darken down one side of the trunk just with a fine line. Just gives it a little bit of shape. So I think I'm just going to put one more branch on here. It looks a little bit too symmetrical to me. So I'm just going to pull this one in, make that slightly wider. Down there. Then we can put some autumn leaves in at the bottom. So we're going to go back with our original colours. Just going to mix that one in. Pick up a little bit of the trunk colour. Just got water on here now. I'm just going to fade these out. Actually just pick a little bit out of here. I'm going to go pop that back in. Bit of brighter yellow. We'll put a few green ones. Tiny bit of red, that alizarin crimson. A few dots of brown. So I'm just going to have a quick look at this one here. I can definitely see which is my dark side, where the light's coming, where the shadow is. It's nice and dark underneath. The branches are well balanced. It's got a nice thick trunk on it. I could put a little bit of light and dark on here. So what I'm actually going to do is show you how to just lighten one side. Got my kitchen roll to hand. I've got a bit of water on my brush. I'm just going to run that down one side and lift paint off. So now this trunk as well also looks like it's got a shape to it. So it's just one area here. Well, I'm going to darken it. It still looks a little bit light to me. So I'm going in with the pure Payne's Grey. Darken right underneath here. So the other area on this one, which I actually want to correct, is just here. I think this branch is just a little bit too heavy. So again, go on with some water. I'm just going to take that down a little. I'm going to go in with my kitchen towel, paper towel, just there. And while that's still wet, I'm going to pop a little bit of my yellow and orange back on. And I'm much happier with that. A little bit of orange on. My darkest green. So I think that actually looks much better now without that great big branch at the top. So I'll just give you a recap. So the first thing that I did was decide which was my light and which was my shadow. And I put one line for my trunk and just a few little branches. So remembering that the branches come out at the bottom. So the first branches on a tree are growing up towards the sunlight. The more the tree grows, the branches have to reach out to get up towards the sunlight until they're at the bottom and they're growing at almost 45 degrees. So at right angles. But we didn't put an awful lot of information on there. Then we mixed up 3 colours. So this one, if you remember, I put too much blue in. So these are the ones that I opted for, which was our sap green, just with a little bit of Payne's Grey and a tiny bit of blue in. This was the sap green with the yellow. And this was the sap green with a lot more blue in. So we ended up with 3 colours. First one we put on was our lovely bright green in a wet on wet method. Then we built that up with our other 2. For our autumn tree, we did exactly the same. We started off with our first layer, which was our bright green, and then we added into that a nice bright orange, some darker reds, some dark green and some browns. So we're keeping the dark areas towards the bottom and towards the shadow side. And then we did our trunks. So we took our raw umber, our brown colour, and we added into that a little bit of green just to give us a nice natural looking trunk. And that time we used our rigger brush, our nice fine brush, to do our branches, and the slightly thicker one for the trunk. And then the last thing I've done is just to darken and lighten, just to give that some shape. So those are the things you have to remember. Your shadow, your light, keep it darker underneath, and really less is more. So I hope you've learned a lot from that session. I call it a masterclass. I think that might make a few people a little bit daunted, but there we go. That's how easy it is. So I look forward to seeing you again, and we'll paint some more trees.